Welcome, welcome everyone. Welcome Sarah, welcome everyone here. Thank you for being here for our last talk of this semester, of this year actually. I'm happy that so many people are attending again. COVID brings many disadvantages, miseries, but the pandemic also forces us to bring the museum talks online. So today we can welcome not only our Leiden students and alumni, Dutch colleagues, but also everyone else from Leiden, the Netherlands, Europe, even the world. Registration showed us that we have many American, Asian colleagues among us. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to thank Femke Stokkel, Antine Hartman and Sandrine de Jong for their support and enthusiasm. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Sarah Moran. We already tried this in the middle of the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in March. I think that you would give the talk. Unfortunately, that didn't, or in April, I guess, but that didn't work out because we were not that well organized to doing it online than we are now. Now it's beginning to become a second nature, I guess. So I'm very happy to see you here today. Physically would have been better, but I'm happy I want to do this today. Sarah received her PhD from Brown University and worked at the Institute for Art History at the University of Bern before she went to Utrecht University to work as lecturer. Her primary interests are in the roles of art and architecture in the Counter-Reformation and in women's patronage, viewership, and relationships to material culture. She has widely published on these topics, and her book, Unconventional Women in the Habsburg Low Countries, 1585-1794, The Visual Culture of the Court Biganages, is forthcoming very soon, Sarah said me yesterday. I'm looking forward to it because I'm going to live in one of those biganages in the recent future. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the American-Belgian Educational Foundation, the Swiss National Science Foundation, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. Sarah, thanks you very much for being here. I will put your PowerPoint on, and then the floor is yours. There's the PowerPoint. The floor is yours, Sarah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Stein. Yeah, it's wonderful to be part of the lecture series, which has been amazing so far. You've done such a great job putting this together. So I'm really happy to participate. And thank you to everyone who is showing up in these strange times. Yeah, I'm really happy to be able to present this research. So before I get into it, I did want to point out that this is actually already published. It's in an edited book that I put together with Amanda Pipkin at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte that came out last year. And so what I'm presenting today is a condensed version of my chapter in this. And I will show you the chapters. So mine's the last one. We have a lot of other amazing authors. And this is open access. So, of course, I welcome any questions that you have today, but if, there's stuff that I don't get to and you're curious about details, you may go ahead and download it. It is free. So we will get started. My talk is called Resurrecting the Spiritual Daughters, the Case of the Houtappel Chapel in the Jesuit Church of Antwerp. On July 21st of 1640, the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Jesuit order, a short but grand procession took place inside the Antwerp Jesuit Church, shown here. Members of the community's Marian sodality, a confraternity dedicated to the promotion of the cult of the Virgin, carried a statue of Our Lady of Scherpenheuvel from the church's northern lateral chapel, where it had been kept temporarily, back to the southern chapel, which is outlined in red and is the topic of my presentation. The chapel had been erected in about 1620 to 1622, specifically to house this miraculous statue, which has its own story that I don't have time to get into here. But this is really the centerpiece of the chapel. It had been given to the Jesuits around 1606 by the Archduke Albert of Austria. And in the years before that 1640 procession, sculptors and artisans had been installing the sculptures and panels of intricately carved, multicolored Italian marble that still adorn the space today. The finishing touches were added to the chapel in the 1640s and 1650s, and its decorative schema survives largely intact. Both the sumptuous, iconographically integrated decoration and the innovative Italianate architecture make this chapel one of the most important examples of Flemish Baroque religious space, a real jewel within the dazzling Jesuit Church of Antwerp. Before I started research on this space, the chapel had previously been studied mainly in terms of the involvement of Peter Paul Rubens, whose Assumption of the Virgin adorned the high altar. And just to be clear, the painting that you see on the altar here is a copy. The original's in Vienna. So Rubens probably directed at least part of the overall design of the stucco and marble decoration as well. But what I'm interested in is patronage. The chapel was funded by women, the extremely wealthy sisters Anna Maria Christina and Lucretia Susanna Houtappel, and their cousin Anna Grevens, who made the space into their family tomb. These women were members of the spiritual daughter movement, in which women vowed to live chaste, spiritually focused lives without joining a convent or another religious community, under the direction of a spiritual father who is most often a member of the Jesuit order. In fact, wealthy spiritual daughters played a major role in funding the construction and the decoration of the entire Jesuit church in Antwerp. Bert Timmermans has estimated that roughly a third of the total donations towards this project came from such women. They were known for their conservative dress, draped in long black mantles, and their involvement in church life. It may well be that Sebastian Franks painted this view of the Jesuit church interior, with the many women we see here depicted reflecting those spiritual daughters' presence in and importance to the church space. My study of the Houtappel and Grevens women as patrons of the Chapel of the Virgin is just one example, though probably the very grandest, of spiritual daughter patronage in this period. But I hope that it pushes scholars to give more attention to the role of such women in funding Counter-Reformation art and architecture in the Southern Low Countries. So who are these ladies? Before going into the art, I will give a brief sketch of the linked histories of the Houtappel and Grevens families and the Jesuits of Antwerp from the mid-16th century through their relocation during the Calvinist takeover of the city in 1577 to 85, and then into the first 2 decades of the 17th century as both groups reestablished themselves in the city. The Houtappel sisters and Anna Grevens belonged to the wealthy merchant class that had profited during Antwerp's economic heyday in the early and mid-16th century. And I've put together a family tree here. The names that are sort of blocked out are the people that we're going to be discussing. The Houtappel sisters and, the sister's father, Godfried Houtappel, partnered with the brothers Simon and Pascal de Decker in the early modern equivalent of an import-export firm with branches in Antwerp, Venice, and Naples. And by the 1570s, they had also established a branch in Cologne. In 1571, Godfried married Cornelia Bolt, with whom he would have at least 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters. As Protestant sentiments rose in the Low Countries, spilling over into a wave of iconoclasm during the miracle year of 1566 to 67, and the start in 1568 of armed insurrections against Spain led by William of Orange, the Houtappels and their circle remained staunchly Catholic, supporting the fledgling Jesuit community that had arrived in Antwerp in 1562 to combat this spreading heresy. The Jesuits' new establishment was, however, short-lived. Protestants gained control of the city and declared it a Calvinist republic in 1577, evicting or expelling the religious orders from the city. Many Antwerp Jesuits took refuge in Cologne, which was also the destination for a number of wealthy Catholic families seeking a more hospitable and stable home. The Houtappel Boats Grevens group traveled at least twice to Italy before they also landed in Cologne in 1590, when the youngest Houtappel daughter, Lucretia Susanna, was born. It was there that they would have met the young Jesuit Carolus Scribanius, who would be the spiritual father to 4 of their 5 daughters, and who would later, in 1612, become provincial superior of the Flemish Jesuits, and who would partly oversee the building of the Antwerp Jesuit Church. So here we have portraits of the couple of Godfried and Cornelia that were executed while they were in Cologne in 1597, and a later portrait of Scribanius. By 1607, Godfried and Cornelia had returned to Antwerp, where they bought a large house called the Big Ruby, and 3 adjacent houses on the Lange Nieuwestraat, marked here with an orange dot. This was a wealthy area near St. James's Church, where the couple originally planned to be buried, and close to where the Jesuits would soon build their new complex, which is marked in an orange circle. In 1609, the couple also purchased the castle Zevenbergen outside of Antwerp, a landed estate which gained Godfried the title Lord of Ranst and elevated the family to the ranks of the nobility. The Jesuits, meanwhile, had returned to Antwerp immediately upon the city's fall to Spanish forces in 1585, and they made the city their center of operations in the Low Countries. The Houtappel daughters and Cornelia Boot were donating towards their projects by at least 1609. Under Scribanius's leadership, plans were made for a new building complex in the heart of Antwerp, which would include residential and administrative buildings and a modestly sized public square, defined by a church, a library, and a sodality house, all built in a classicist Italianate style. A design was approved by the Superior General in Rome in 1615, but as some of the members of this audience might know, the project quickly became grander and grander. The cost ballooned to the massive sum of over 500,000 guilders, and repeated rebukes came from Rome over the debts that the project was incurring, and specifically in 1620 for adding the 2 large lateral chapels to the church without permission. But the Antwerp Jesuits just continued to borrow, to build, and decorate what would be an incredibly rich space, and the church was dedicated in 1621. So the addition of those 2 large chapels seems to have been made possible due to spiritual daughter patronage, and for us the key event is Cornelia Boot's death in 1620. So sadly for the family, by that time, all of the 5 sons, as well as their oldest daughter, were deceased. So this meant that Maria Anna Christina and Lucretia Susanna, all spiritual daughters now who had pledged to remain virgins and childless, were alone in carrying on their parents' legacy. They would have received a massive inheritance on their mother's death, and they decided to use that money to create a grand burial chapel for themselves and their parents, also adding their cousin Anna Grevens to the project. Lucretia Susanna then died in 1622, and her epitaph states that she left her property to her sisters, quote, "to be given back to God, lest they build, donate, and adorn a temple of God without her." In 1626, Godfried also died, at which point the remaining half of the couple's estate would have passed to Maria, Anna, and Christina. So we have some very, very wealthy women. All of the family members, along with their maid, Anna Moons, and Carolus Scribanius himself, would be buried in the crypt beneath the chapel. This was stripped of its decoration during the French occupation. I've been down there. It's a very sad little space. But we do have a drawing of the Subterranean altar by Hans von Mildert, which bears a date of 1635, so somewhat later. And it shows a carved marble crucifixion flanked by symbols of the Passion. And this is where probably the many memorial masses for the family members would have taken place. So upstairs, the construction of this of the built space began in 1620 or 1621. The main phases of decoration stretched until about 1645, with at least one later addition in 1657. So for much of the rest of the talk, I'm going to sketch the chronology of this process and some of the expenses laid out for it as far as can be gleaned from documentary evidence. And this documentary evidence is largely accounts kept by the Jesuits that are in the Jesuit archive, as well as some wills from the Houtappel sisters and Anna Grevens. These women were established as the chapel's patrons by November or December of 1622, when records state that the space was dedicated to these women and that their arms had been hung there in recognition of the, quote, many good deeds that they have done for our society, i.e. the Jesuits. Decorative efforts seemed first to have been focused around the altar, which, along with the altar of the St. Ignatius Chapel, so the other large chapel, which was also funded by spiritual daughters that I do not have time to talk about. So those were both dedicated on Pentecost of 1625. The state of the apse was described by Florentius de Montmorency in a report to the Superior General in Rome, Vitelleschi, excuse my Italian, of that same year of 1625, which tells us that the miraculous statue of Our Lady of Scherpenheuvel had been placed on the altar, as had Rubens' Assumption of around 1611 to 1614. And this is actually a painting that was made for the Antwerp Cathedral and then for some reason rejected, not installed there. So we're not sure exactly how that painting came to be installed in this chapel. Neither the designer nor the sculptor of the carved altar frame are recorded, but based on stylistic and circumstantial evidence, they were probably Rubens and Hans von Mildert. And the most striking architectural element of the chapel is its use of a hidden light source in the form of a window set into the wall of a small barrel vault above the altar, which together with the chapel's south-facing windows really illuminate the space. And so this is a kind of device that's very famously used by Bernini sometime later for his St. Teresa altarpiece, but we see it happening here even earlier. So according to de Montmorency, the chapel altar was in 1625 as yet, quote, imperfect, but he assured his reader that this would be easily rectified through the generosity of the community's donors. The Houtappel sisters and Anna Grevens, he stated, had already made, quote, many and great gifts towards the chapel of the Virgin, and would continue to show all industry and care, working day and night to see to its ornamentation. The same letter refers to the chapel as that of the Queen of Heaven. So he'd already referred to it before as the chapel of the Great Mother of God. Here he refers to it as that of the Queen of Heaven. And we can link that to what must have been a near complete altar space and its iconography. So viewers saw in Rubens' altarpiece the Virgin miraculously borne up into heaven. And I show you here the original that's in Vienna. So this is happening 3 days after her death, while the apostles and bystanders marvel at the empty tomb below. The image was then narratively expanded by that marble figure of God at the top of the altar, who reached down to place a gilded crown, which is now gone, onto Mary's head as she rose. De Montmorency's reference to heaven also suggests that the stucco ceiling had already been completed or at least that its plans had been finalized. We have a design for the ceiling attributed to Rubens that's in the Albertina. The execution has been attributed to Andries Collijns de Nola, and the ceiling features symbols of the Virgin set into a heavenly space with angels. It was certainly on view by the Feast of the Nativity of 1631 when the Archduchess Isabella and Marie de' Medici visited the church. On March 13th of 1635, the three Houtappel sisters and Anna Grevens contracted with Robrecht Collijns de Nola and his nephew Andries to clothe or bekleden the chapel in marble. The cost for the project was to be 21,000 guilders paid in installments, with Anna Grevens contributing half the amount and the Houtappels the other half. While Rubens is presumed to have designed the installation, the contract makes reference only to a drawing, quote, delivered and signed by a certain Jesuit named Johannes van Dam. I know nothing else about him. Which the drawing is described as marked with letters donating where every different type of stone was to be used, marble of black, red, white, as well as variegated Italian marbles, quote, whether black and yellow or green, white, or whatever sorts are available. The women further ordered 6 figures of white Carrara marble, each 6 feet high, being Our Lady with the Christ Child, Saint Joseph, Saint Joachim, Saint Anna, Saint Christina, and Saint Lucretia or Susanna. And Joachim would effectively be replaced by Saint Catherine. I'll touch on that in a moment. The contract stipulated that the work was to be completed in 3.5 years, but the sculptors died. So Robrecht died in 1636, Andries in 1638, and the commission was then transferred to other artists. So the actual installation took a little bit longer. So the carved figures would come to represent the patron saints of the Houtappel sisters and their mother, with Saint Joseph apparently kind of standing in for their father Godfried in his patriarchal role. And the figures of the Virgin and Saint Joseph attributed to the Collijns de Nola workshop were probably completed first, so between 1635 and 1640. These were then followed by Roman-era Virgin martyrs Susanna, Christina, and Catherine. So Catherine, I figured out after some research, is effectively the patron saint of women named Cornelia. So Catherine comes to stand for as the patron of their mother, Cornelia Boot, and also Saint Anne for both Anna Grevens and Anna Houtappel. Anna Grevens wrote a will in 1638 referring to a number of paintings that were still to be installed in the chapel between the marble panels. These are a little bit difficult to kind of trace and work out. Most of them seem to have been removed or replaced, possibly in connection to the fire that damaged the nave in the 18th century. We do have a later text of 1700 that allows us to identify most of the original themes. Several are just missing, so there was a return from Egypt, portraits of Cornelia and Godfried that had inscriptions with them that named them as the parents of the sisters and the founders of the chapel. There's a flower picture that is attributed to Rubens that is also not there. One in the back of the chapel, though, so below the Houtappel coat of arms, is still in situ. And this is Cornelis Schutz. Circumcision, which is an unusual composition. So it removes the scene from its typical temple setting to an ambiguous heavenly or timeless space. So we have in the center the Virgin holding her son in her lap while the priest kneels at her feet. 2 angels assist with the procedure, while others floating above bear symbols of Christ's passion. So it's a circumcision as prefiguration of the sacrifice, so 2 blood sacrifices, circumcision prefiguring the crucifixion. We can also trace, and here's, forgot to skip slide there. Here's the full view of the circumcision. So virgin and child in the center, the priest to the side performing the procedure. We can also trace 2 paintings that were installed on the southern wall that have now been removed. They're both by Gerard Segers. One is now in the Antwerp Museum of Fine Arts. The other is in Vienna. And both of these also have a kind of unusual iconography, again, centered around the Virgin Mary. So the Antwerp picture presents the viewer with the biblical episode in which the resurrected Christ, recognizable as such by his palm fronds and his wounds, and this is the bottom picture in color, greets his mother. So after he's been crucified and resurrected, he appears to Mary. Mary is depicted as having just been interrupted in prayer, kneeling before a table-like altar, again with signs of the Passion around her. Christ, on the other side, has just returned from hell/limbo and trails behind him Old Testament figures that he has released. And we can recognize King David, Moses, and Adam and Eve. Also in the group, oddly, are Saint Joseph and 2 anonymous souls, apparently signifying Christ's sacrifice as having made possible the salvation of those who came before, but also all those who come after him. The Vienna painting at the top, the black and white image, depicts an apocryphal scene, and this is one that I've only found a few other depictions of for the 17th century, and they mostly seem to be in Spain or coming from Spain. So this is St. John the Evangelist administering communion to Mary. It's not a subject that's gotten much attention, but it is this apocryphal scene, and it constitutes a kind of curious reintegration of the body of Christ through the host into that of Mary, who is herself the site of his incarnation. So one more major piece of decoration was installed in 1657 when Anna Houtappel, who's the last surviving sister, added one final piece of furniture, an ornate marble white communion rail that we see here at center bottom. In the center of this communion rail are the monogram of the Virgin Mary, and then on either side, angels whose bodies sort of trail away into cornucopia forms, sprouting leaves and roses. As we move outward, these intertwine with Eucharistic symbols, oversized ears of wheat referring to the host as the body of Christ, and wine, grapes for the wine of his blood. So this work formed a sacramental pendant to the chapel's confessionals, and you can see the edges of a couple of these in this image. I found no documentary evidence about the confessionals, but they very clearly are shaped to sort of fit within the broader panels of marble, and I think they were probably put in then during the 1640s when the marble decoration was being completed. So this communion rail would have then formed a kind of sacramental pendant to those confessionals. So penitents visiting the chapel would first confess and then kneel before the altar, before this communion rail, to receive the host during the Mass. So the Houtappel sisters and Anna Grevens thus created this sumptuous monument to themselves and to their family, one on which they inscribed their own identities through the statues of their patron saints and their coats of arms. Anna Grevens' arms are visible at the top. Let me get our pointer. Yeah. Can you see that, the pointer? No. Okay.
Oh, not see it. So if you
see it on my end, but I think I just made a dot. So it's there's a marble coat of arms at the very peak of this arch that goes over the altar. So Anna Scriven's arms are there. The Houtappel family's arms are in the back of the chapel here. And keeping these arms was clearly very important to the sisters. The last document we have from these women is a request from Anna in 1669 to the King of Spain that they be allowed to keep the arms in the chapel. And the reason that that was necessary was that Maria had basically sold the rights, sold the castle at Zevenbergen, and thus kind of the rights to be called noble to her cousin. And so they were no longer noble at this point. And technically, you're not supposed to keep a coat of arms in a family chapel or use them in general if you're not noble. So Anna writes a letter to the King of Spain and says, you know, when these were installed, my father was the Lord of Reims, so, you know, can we please keep these up? And that permission was granted. So it was very important for them to keep those markers of their identity here. So the chapel, you know, is very much about, you know, a monument by these women to themselves and to their families. It makes a statement about their own kind of space in the social and religious fabric of the city, while at the same time really participating in the broader Counter-Reformation program to promote orthodoxy, in which, of course, the Jesuits played a major role. So taken together, the iconography kind of represents a really remarkably comprehensive defense of Catholic tenets that were specifically denied by Protestants. So the power of the saints and the Virgin Mary to intercede on the part of sinners, the existence of purgatory, the spiritual value of virginity and celibacy, the centrality of the sacraments, and really the validity of religious art itself, including that miraculous image of the Sacramental Virgin, who, you know, for whom this chapel really kind of created a really, the whole chapel is sort of like a jewel box that surrounds that image, right? That's the miraculous, really most powerful object in the space. So in examining this chapel, I think that it really pushes us as art and architectural historians to more carefully consider how gendered norms have shaped not only our own historiography, but also the sources that we work with. So these women did not, you know, inscribe their own names into the space. They didn't put their own portraits into the space. Their names only appear right before the altar. And they really highlighted their father as kind of, you know, he's the patron and founder of the chapel in inscriptions. But it was really who were paying for and directing the decoration. So, you know, this kind of elision of women's patronage happens even at a source level, but then it kind of gets reproduced over and over by us as art historians. So that has had kind of the focus on Godfried as the presumed patron of this chapel has had effects on how people date things that are in it that I found were not true. And I can go into that further if you like. But I think we really need to be careful about these gendered issues. And on a more sort of specific kind of research sense, it looks to me like spiritual daughters in particular played a really big role in the rebuilding of churches and convents and their decoration during the Counter-Reformation in the southern Low Countries, and that there is much more work to be done in uncovering that patronage. And I am going to be doing some of that myself, but I do hope that others join me. So I will wrap it up here and open the floor, I guess, to questions or comments.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Sarah, to give such a very profound insight in the patronage of this very, very, very impressive chapel, very rich chapel for sure. How exceptional actually are these kind of chapels in Counter-Reform Flanders, or the southern Netherlands, if you want to call it like that. How to relate it, for example, to the whole project of Scherpenheuvel itself?
Well, yeah. So I think to your first point, this chapel is definitely and was definitely exceptional in its scale and its expense. So there are records from travelers who talk about the Jesuit church in general as being incredibly beautifully decorated. And sometimes they mention this chapel as like the marble chapel. It is called a jewel box at some point. So it was certainly exceptional in kind of quality, expense, scale, probably level of the integration of all of this decoration. That said, the various elements that it uses and the kind of approach and this impulse to create family monuments, like that is fairly common. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned Bert Timmerman's book. It's a Patronen van Patronage, and he does a lot of work on this topic. And to how this fits in with Scherpenheuvel. So let me go back to our little statue. So this statue, Scherpenheuvel is a Marian pilgrimage site that's really kind of born out of the Dutch revolt, out of that war. So it is a kind of common thing for miraculous statues of the Virgin Mary to just appear in trees, like that happens. The Scherpenheuvel Virgin appears in, I want to say 1587 outside of Diest, and has sort of a small cult. And then roughly 1602, 1603, the Jesuits get really interested in promoting that cult, and the archdukes get really interested. And by, I want to say 1626, they're building the basilica around this miraculous image. So Scherpenheuvel is an important Marian pilgrimage site, and you go there to pray and to get healed. And it's really a kind of focal point in this promotion of the cult of the Virgin Mary. The original tree in which that original statue appeared, the Jesuits had it cut down at a certain point because there was concern that people were going and like taking pieces off of it, and that it was going to get idolatrous. So the Jesuits had it cut down. They divided the wood and allowed certain people to make, quote, copies. Like, they don't actually all look like the original, but copies of the Scherpenheuvel Virgin out of the original wood. So it is kind of extra miraculous. This is one of those early copies, and it is supposedly made by a Beguine named Barbara van Ursel, who was one of the superiors at the Antwerp Beguinage. She was a stepmother of Lancelot van Ursel. I'm sorry, the aunt of Lancelot van Ursel, who was a mayor of Antwerp. So she's like very fancy. Luc Durlot's book about Scherpenheuvel says that she sculpted this image. I haven't been able to trace the actual source for that. But in any case, this is a copy of Scherpenheuvel, of the Virgin of Scherpenheuvel, made out of kind of magic wood. So it's very precious. And so the chapel definitely was conceived to house this object. And now whether that is the Jesuits' idea or whether the Houtappel sisters were like, oh, we've just come into all this money. Would you like a large chapel? And also it'll be our tomb. I don't know. But there are aspects of the way this kind of story goes on that indicate that the women really did have quite a bit of power, or agency, if we want to say that, over the chapel space. So, for example, they buried Scribanius in their family tomb, and the general superior in Rome got really mad about that because Jesuits are not supposed to have fancy burials. And he wrote a letter to the Jesuits saying, please at least take the epitaph down, because they'd installed this very laudatory epitaph to Scribanius. And they just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. So, and the letter was in the wording was like, please ask the Houtappel ladies to take this epitaph down. And yeah, it was still there when the French came in and tore all the brass plaques out of the crypt chapel to make guns. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
All right. There's a very interesting question by Jeffrey Mildert, concerning the anti-Jesuit forgery, the Moneta Secreta.
Oh no!
So it accused the Jesuits of manipulating wealthy women to donate large sums of decoration of churches. This charge implies crafty Jesuits and manipulable women. Do the Houtappel sisters challenge this attack?
I think that they complicate it. Because there are these moments where, it seems like they're the decision makers. They're also just incredibly wealthy. So there is an account book that tracks their donations. So not even necessarily payments they made for this chapel, but just donations to the Antwerp Jesuit College. And that is 304,000 guilders. Mm-hmm. Which is massive. So let's say this. I think there's a kind of symbiosis happening. So like, yes, the Jesuits totally went after wealthy women and were like, hey, you can have, this status and be involved in religious life and probably get to heaven quicker. It'll be great. You could also, help us fund our projects. Like that's definitely happening, but the women are getting something out of it as well, right? I mean, they get to build this incredible monument in this incredibly, public, well-visited church. And they do get to go to heaven quicker, right? So if people are coming in and attending their memorial masses and praying for them as donors of this beautiful chapel, then according to Catholic beliefs, they should get time off of purgatory for that. So I think it's symbiotic. Yes, patriarchy is still structuring all of this, of course.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about the Rubens painting. So the central Rubens painting now in Vienna. What's the history of it? So how did it come up? How did it?
Maria Theresa took it. That's the story. So, the Empress Maria Theresa took it. Mm-hmm. And it was replaced by a totally different painting for a while. So this copy is only from the 19th century. Like it wasn't, so Maria Theresa took it in the later 18th century. And it wasn't that they made a copy immediately and installed it. There was something else there for a good while, but I'm not remembering the exact dates on that. So yeah, that's just the Habsburgs just take stuff.
Oh, yes. Resurrecting has a question. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I was wondering if the archival documents also mention the paintings of Hendrik van Balen on marble.
They do. I wasn't sure how to shorten this, but that got cut out. So the von Ballen paintings are mentioned in 1625 in this letter that I mentioned that's talking about the state of the altar. So the von Ballen paintings were there in 1625, and I don't have an image to easily show you. But there are these beautiful small oil paintings on marble. There are, I believe, 8 of them, and they're scenes from the Virgin's life. So this really, kind of expands upon this Marian emphasis throughout the chapel. So yes, they are mentioned. We don't have, any kind of contract, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. A question by Hui Ming, maybe just to concentrate again, to bring back in very concentrated form your argument. So the female patrons did, of course, play a role in the design, but can you just briefly say how exactly, where was the emphasis of their role in the design? Did the artists compromise during decorating the Antwerp Church due to the Titanic deficit?
Wait, those are two.
Those are two different questions. So yeah.
I don't see them in the chat. Could you repeat?
So the first question, let's go to the first one. Where was exactly the role of the patrons in this chapel?
That is difficult. So on the one hand, there is a lot of evidence for these women making donations to the Jesuits from 1609 onwards. They are mentioned during this back and forth, in the whole kind of building of a deficit period where the Antwerp Jesuits are writing to Rome and being like, don't worry about the money. We have really good donors. So the Houtappels specifically are mentioned there, where there's pretty clearly an intervention, I think, or where you can definitely see their voices is in the contract for the sculptural decoration.
Yes.
So they're pretty specific, and they are the ones signing the contract, right? Of course, you can't say anything about what there's no trace of, but they are the ones signing the contract, and negotiating payments after sculptors die and have to be replaced. The fact that the contract asks for a sculpture of Joachim, and that doesn't happen, and the sculpture of St. Catherine is put up, I would attribute to the ladies. The Jesuits are not especially interested in virgin martyr saints, like they don't really care so much. So it would really be the patrons that have an interest, in this case, in installing a figure of their mother's patron saint. Mm-hmm. The will of Honest Grevens makes mention of payments for the marble decoration and also for installing the paintings that aren't there yet, and really kind of lays out, here's the money that's set aside for that, and it only goes to that. There are numerous documents, largely of the sisters that live the longest, so Maria and Anna, where they're making donations to the Jesuits, but they're like very kind of clear about like, okay, they can have this, but they're only allowed to use the income from these funds. Being very sort of specific about what the Jesuits get and don't get. So I am speculating here, but I think it would be wrong to assume that these women were just kind of like silent, obedient money pots. Mm-hmm. There's also a translation of what is her name? The life of a very kind of famous 16th century Italian mystic. There's a Dutch translation that's done by one of the Antwerp Jesuits that is dedicated to these women, to the Houtappels and Anna Grevens from 1631, and has this kind of long laudatory intro where it's like, oh, this is dedicated to you, but you don't really need it because you're already so virtuous and amazing. So there are these signs of the women having a certain amount of power in their relationship to the Jesuits. Mm-hmm. Is how I put it. But it is really, really hard to kind of parse out who's making every single decision.
Mm-hmm. Then a question I don't understand myself very well, to be honest. Do you know any number of women joining the Jesuitesses movement in Antwerp? But or other cities in the southern Netherlands?
That is not something that I've really looked at.
I wouldn't know that either, to be really honest. That's why I'm saying this question with a bit of doubt. So
yeah, it's been a while since I've thought about Mary Ward. I'm not sure. But there were lots of spiritual daughters. Like, it's a very common thing to be. I don't remember numbers, but some kind of overviews have been written that don't deal with art and architecture at all, but that just deal with the movement in general. And it does seem pretty centered in Antwerp, like it was already starting in the 16th century. And yeah, it's definitely a popular thing in the Low Countries. There are also similar movements that have different names in other regions, and there's a lot of work to be done on kind of pulling that together and seeing, is this a concerted, like, international thing or not?
Mm-hmm. Another question by Ekaterina Dominia. I hope I pronounced it well. In how far there are still personal possessions left of the ladies, for example, rosaries, and how they were treated or how they are treated.
No. What I do have is an inventory. So I have nothing material, to be clear. So the portraits of their parents are now in the Hermitage. And of course the artworks that are still or were in the chapel, those are really the only material kind of traces I have. There is an inventory in the Jesuit archives of their house chapel. So when the last sister finally died, she left the things in their house chapel to the Jesuits. And that is really interesting. It has a number of portraits of different family members. And then it also has like 5 sets of matching liturgical vestments and altar cloths, and other things, chalices, like liturgical instruments, which pretty clearly shows that they are having mass in their house.
Yes.
Which is pretty cool. So I could just imagine, one of the Jesuits having to come over like every week or every day, and like, oh, I've got to do mass for the old ladies again. But
and then a question regarding your central topic, actually, your speciality. So don't make it too long. But Anna de Bruin asks, in how far patronage of women is gendered? Can you really put that in a gendered position? Are these forms of patronage that were considered specifically fitting for women, for example?
That is a very good question.
Or that you would think so.
Yeah. That's difficult. I mean, I think that there are constraints, certainly, that women are going to be judged more for how kind of like, for their space, their kind of public identity, right? So you don't want to appear. You don't want to be too loud. Your patronage should be chaste and pious, like you are. I mean, for religious patronage, I expect that overall you'd see more iconography of female saints. That's certainly what I find at the Béguinages. Of course, how much that is linked to wanting your patron saint, which of course for women are going to be women, mostly. I'm not sure how you can tease those things out. I think this is a very good question, and I don't have a good answer yet. I do suspect that in women's homes, what I've found, at least for the Beguines, who are kind of semi-religious, so that is a factor, that they do not have any mythological paintings that I've been able to trace. So, which means that they don't have pictures that could just be seen as that have a bunch of secular stories with naked people in them. And I think that's significant, but I don't know if that's a Beguine thing or a woman thing.
All right. Last question by Judith Norman. Would you say that the iconographic program, with its emphasis on Mary and women saints, can be considered especially appropriate for a female audience, as it is reminiscent of the bidprenten, so the small printed prayers made in the north?
Possibly, but I think that that's an assumption that we should be careful about. So I am not sure. I have not yet, at least, found any sort of contemporary documents that say that sort of thing, that Marian imagery is more appropriate for women to look at. At least not in the sense of like church space. Of course, there are devotional texts that are about women imitating the Virgin Mary. So I am not sure. I think it's something very worth researching, but that you'd have to be careful about.
Thank you very much. And a very, very last question by Evelyn Verheggen. Are there connections to other spiritual orders? Were the sisters only influenced by the Jesuits?
It's mostly, but not exclusively, a Jesuit thing. So you do find spiritual daughters with Dominican or Franciscan spiritual fathers. It does seem like it's at least in the Low Countries, mostly a Jesuit thing. And tying back to Jeff Muller's question, it may well be because the Jesuits, in a very organized way, were like, we are going to, we have in single women a potential source of funding. And, that might be behind it. It might be something else.
All right. Thank you very, very much for this fascinating talk. You see all the questions, you see everyone still attending, so that's great. I want to thank also the audience. Very happy to have you at several lectures and several talks this semester. We will organize this next year too, and we hope to see you then back. So bye everyone. Thank you very much. And see you very soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.